Friends, Doc David here. Let's talk a little bit about boundaries. And what day is it? It is, I've lost track. We're still under quarantine. Things are still going on with shutdowns. Things are opening up a little bit more. It's July. And the weather outside has been in the low 70s. Like, what is going on in our world? We should be experiencing 80s and 90s where I'm living, but it's not happening. So I thought, what a better time to talk about boundaries. Those have nothing to do with one another, but I just was trying to transition easily, and I didn't. So they have nothing to do with one another. But let's talk about boundaries anyways. So we've talked about boundaries before. Boundaries happen all around us. So if you think of this, there's property lines, right? That's a boundary. There's roped off areas. Those are boundaries. There's doors. Those are boundaries. So we see boundaries all over the place. Doors are locked. I have doors to my office here that are locked when I leave. Those are boundaries. And so it's fascinating to me how we live with boundaries around us all the time, but for some reason it gets super difficult to implement good boundaries in our daily lives that we have with friends, families, and strangers. Why do boundaries exist? Boundaries in buildings, for example, boundaries and doors exist to keep people out. Boundaries are made to protect us. Boundaries are created to protect others, but specifically in relationships, boundaries are made, I think, for two big reasons. Boundaries are made to protect us and to give other people information. It protects us from maybe hurtful things that happen in relationships. It also gives other people information about what is appropriate and what is acceptable in the relationship that they have with that other person. Boundaries can seem hurtful. See, I think that's the bad rap that boundaries get. They often seem like they're hurtful when they're given to somebody. And as I've thought about that before, and as I thought about that recently, as I was thinking about what I was going to say here, I think the messaging about boundaries is super important. Now, hear me clearly on this. The messaging around boundaries is super important. I think when they become hurtful, a person says, "You are doing this thing, I need to put up a boundary so I don't have to deal with you." Now, they may not say it like that, but it's implied that a boundary exists because of a person's bad behavior. And if the person doesn't think they have bad behavior, they can take that as an offense, right? I think a different way to talk about boundaries is to say what you need as a person. I need to go to bed early. I need to leave this party. I am not going to go to this function. It could be you're not going to the function because there's a family member there that always gets drunk and is offensive and you just don't want to interact. Okay, that's great. You don't have to share that information. The information you do need to share is, I'm not going to do this thing. That's all you have to do. It is not up to you to explain your boundaries. Now, if you have a good relationship with somebody, you can explain your boundaries, and if they love you and if you're willing to listen to them, then you can have a good conversation back and forth. But it's not your job to explain the reasoning behind your boundaries. If perhaps you are an alcoholic, and you know that you struggle with things related to alcohol, and so you're not going to go to an event. So if someone says, "Hey, come down and booze with us at this event," and you recognize, "Oh man, if I go, I'm going to be super tempted to drink," you simply can put up a boundary and say, "I am not going to go to that." And your friend can say, "Well, why not?" and kind of accuse you of being lame or shame you. And you don't have to give them an explanation. I think a lot of times what I've seen with the boundaries is when a person puts a boundary up, they get shamed for this boundary. And that's difficult relationships, right? That's people not understanding. And I want to suggest respectfully that could be the messaging of how you're putting this boundary up, right? If it's an I versus you, my encouragement, if you have to do a boundary, is that you talk about it from the perspective of I instead of the perspective of you. The more you can talk about I and what's going on inside of here, the better most of the time that it's going to be. Now, one of the things that I don't often hear when people talk about boundaries is mature boundaries. Now, this is an example out of my own life. When I first got married, I started having to create some boundaries in my family for myself. And I got to the place where I was able to give up some of the boundaries when I wanted to, because I knew I could easily create those boundaries again. And I view that as a mature, the ability to be mature in your boundary making. And how I define that is, if you know you can easily enforce a boundary for yourself, then you can look at the relationship and think, is what's being asked of me or is what's being requested of me reasonable? And if you think it's reasonable, then sure, you get to make the choice to engage with that person that normally you have a boundary with. So in my case, my grandfather died, and for whatever reason, my grandmother wanted all the grandsons to wear one of his suits. Now, this suit was like 3 sizes too big for me. I thought it was a dumb idea. And so my initial thought was, they can't make me do this suit. I'm not going to put this on. What a dumb idea. But I wanted to be honorable to my mom, whose dad had just died, and to my grandmother. And so I was willing to not keep that boundary and do that thing because it was a reasonable request. And I did that from a place of, I knew that I didn't have to do this. And if there was going to be pushback on me, I wasn't going to do it and they weren't going to force me. But because I was willing to look at it from, it was a reasonable request, I was willing to do that. That's hard to do because if you're not mature in your boundaries, if you don't do boundaries well or easy, you're going to get sucked back into these dangerous relationships that you were trying to avoid in the first place. So hopefully that's been helpful with giving some ideas on what boundaries are and the messaging behind boundaries to maybe make them a little bit more palatable to the people that you're trying to put boundaries up with. Ultimately, you get to make the choice on what your boundaries are going to be. People around you don't get to do that because they have no idea what's going on internally for you. Hey, I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions or comments or concerns about what I've said, feel free to leave a comment below or email me at headshrinkinc@gmail.com. Have a great weekend.